Have you ever wondered why the sharpest reply to rage is often no reply at all? Picture it. A storm of accusations hurled like arrows, voices rising, veins tightening, anger swelling in another's chest. And yet, before it can pierce you, before it can wound, silence descends. That silence is not weakness. It is the unshakable stillness of a mountain against the thrashing wind. It is the refusal of the soul to be dragged into another's chaos. It is the quiet sword that cuts anger at its root. Anger feeds on resistance. Like fire, it demands oxygen, and every word you hurl back into its blaze only makes the flames leap higher. But silence, the disciplined, intentional silence of one who refuses to be owned, starves it. The storm collapses in on itself. The one who expected battle suddenly stands alone in the emptiness of their own fury. And in that emptiness, something shatters, the illusion of control. To remain silent before anger is not passivity, it is power cloaked in restraint. The Stoics knew this. Marcus Aurelius wrote that the best revenge is not to become like your enemy. When insult strikes, when the shadow of another tries to provoke your shadow, your silence becomes proof that you are no mirror. You are not their puppet. You are not their projection. Their rage belongs to them, not to you. And here lies the profound psychology beneath the Stoic teaching. Anger is rarely about the present moment. It is an echo of the unconscious, a fragment of the shadow breaking loose, a wound from childhood, a humiliation long buried, an unmet need gnawing beneath the surface. These rise up, disguised as fury at you. When someone lashes out, they are not striking you. They are striking the ghost inside themselves. To answer them in kind is to wrestle with their ghosts. But when you are silent, you refuse to dance with their unconscious. You stand instead as the mirror they cannot control. Ask yourself, how often have you fed another's fire with your own words? How often has your attempt to defend, to justify, to fight back only deepened the spiral? You know the truth. No matter how perfect your argument, anger never bows to logic. No explanation, no string of words has ever calmed the truly enraged. Words in that state are stones thrown into a raging river. They vanish without a trace. But silence? Silence makes the angry man hear his own echo. Silence turns the river back on itself. Consider also the dignity in silence. In a world obsessed with reaction, with constant noise, silence feels unnatural, even unbearable. That is why it is so devastating. When someone expects your voice and finds none, when they anticipate your surrender and receive only your stillness, they are forced to face their own nakedness. They cannot hide in the duel of words. They are left alone with the rawness of their own fury, and that loneliness terrifies them, for it reveals the hollowness within. Jung would tell us that silence before anger is not merely self-control, but individuation. It is the refusal to collapse into the unconscious of another. It is the ego standing firm against projection, refusing to carry what was never its burden. In silence, you hold a boundary that says, your shadow is yours, not mine. You may rage, but you cannot conscript me into your battle. This is how silence heals, by forcing each soul to bear its own fire. But do not mistake this silence for withdrawal born of fear. True silence in the Stoic sense is not shrinking away, but standing tall. It is not the silence of avoidance, but the silence of mastery. You stand not as a victim of anger, but as its conqueror. For the man or woman who can resist the compulsion to answer, who can hold steady while another trembles with rage, that one holds dominion, not only over the situation, but over themselves. Imagine now, if you were to embody this silence, what would change in your life? How many battles would dissolve before they began? How much energy would be preserved rather than wasted in the inferno of pointless conflict? How many relationships, even broken ones, would reveal their truth under the weight of your silence? Silence is not merely absence, it is presence distilled. It is the presence of mind that refuses to be shattered. It is the presence of spirit that refuses to be provoked. And it is the presence of discipline that whispers to the world, I am not yours to move. Anger dies where silence stands, and those who master it discover what empires and kings never could, that the greatest conquest is not over lands or armies, but over the self. Silence, when embodied with intention, does not simply halt the external quarrel. It reshapes the internal landscape. When anger pounds against your stillness and finds no door open, something remarkable occurs. The battle turns inward, but not within you. It returns to its source. The furious person is forced to sit in the echo chamber of their own storm, hearing at last the true object of their rage, themselves. And in that confrontation, you are no longer their opponent. You have become their mirror. The ancients recognized this. Seneca warned that he who angers you conquers you. Words given in haste, retaliation flung like stones. These are the chains that bind you to another's chaos. But silence is the breaking of chains. It is the refusal to kneel to the tyranny of impulse. In that refusal, your dignity rises higher than any victory that words might win. You become untouchable, not because you are immune to pain, but because you refuse to let pain command your voice. Psychologically, silence interrupts the cycle of projection. Anger thrives on dragging others into its orbit, transferring guilt, shame, or fear onto any available target. It is the psyche's desperate attempt to lighten its burden by handing it to you. But when you do not respond, when your silence is steady, the projection fails. The psyche must carry its own weight. Jung saw this as a form of shadow work forced upon the angry soul. The shadow, denied the chance to be disowned, must be faced in the mirror of solitude. Yet the one who practices silence is not untouched by fire. Inside, silence requires discipline. Your chest may still pound, your hands may still tremble, your tongue may still ache to speak. But mastery is not the absence of impulse. It is the command of impulse. The warrior who trembles but does not flee is braver than the one who never feels fear. So, it is with silence. The voice in you that longs to defend, to justify, to retaliate, that voice is the wild horse. Your silence is the reins that hold it steady. Notice too the difference between silence born of repression and silence born of strength. Repression hides words in fear, but the silence of mastery radiates calm. It does not cower. It does not flee the moment. It looks into the eyes of anger and says, without saying, "You cannot move me." And paradoxically, it is that silent presence that carries the most profound authority. Think of a king upon his throne. A servant storms in, shouting, accusing, demanding. The king does not rise, does not answer. He waits, watching, and the silence becomes unbearable to the servant, who soon realizes he has only revealed his own smallness. Silence here is majesty. Silence is command. And you, though not a king, hold the same power whenever you refuse to be stirred by the noise of another storm. Modern psychology affirms this ancient wisdom. Therapists who work with trauma survivors often speak of the power of non-reactivity. To break the cycle of abuse or conflict, one must learn to pause, to hold space, rather than collapse into instinctive reaction. Silence, then, is not only a tool against the anger of others, but a medicine for one's own wounds. Each time you remain silent, you rewrite the script of your past. You prove to yourself that you are no longer enslaved to patterns of defense, that you are capable of standing in your own strength without surrendering to the noise around you. And what happens when silence is practiced long enough? Something extraordinary. You begin to feel the stillness, not as a mask, but as a core. It ceases to be an effort and becomes a state. Your silence is no longer a tactic, but a truth. You discover that your power was never in your words at all, but in your presence. That even without speaking, you radiate a kind of force that cannot be bought, broken, or controlled. Perhaps this is why silence unsettles so many. People fear silence because it exposes them. Without your words to hide behind, they must confront their own nakedness. Silence peels away illusion, leaving only reality. And reality, for the unprepared, can be unbearable. But for you, the one who dares to wield silence, this is liberation. Each time you resist the compulsion to fill the void, you discover the vastness of your own soul. You are no longer dragged by the current of others' chaos. You are the riverbank that contains it. You are the still point around which storms must circle. And slowly, inevitably, anger loses its power over you. Silence is not the absence of power. It is the refinement of it. Words are crude tools, often spilling more than they carve, while silence is a scalpel, cutting with precision where speech would only wound the innocent flesh around the truth. In the face of another's rage, silence transforms you from participant to witness. You are no longer entangled in the chaos. You become the mirror that reveals it. The paradox is this: when you do not respond, the angry one is left to wrestle with their own demons. They wanted you to carry their weight, to ignite their fire with your spark. But instead, they are handed only the echo of their own voice. And in that echo, truth resounds louder than any retort you could have offered. It is here that silence becomes more destructive to anger than words ever could, because it dismantles the illusion that rage is shared. It forces ownership. This is why silence is feared by those who thrive on domination. To control another, anger needs reaction. It seeks to mold you, to push you, to make you prove yourself. And if you resist with words, even your defiance grants them ground. But when you resist with silence, you give nothing. No soil for their seeds, no oxygen for their fire. You stand outside the game, and in doing so, you win without ever playing. Modern relationships prove this again and again. Think of the arguments that spiral endlessly, two voices rising higher and higher, each convinced that one more phrase will tip the balance. Yet no phrase ever does. Only exhaustion ends it. But when silence enters the room, true, poised silence, the argument loses its fuel. Suddenly, the one who shouts feels foolish. The noise collapses under its own weight. The psychological depth here is profound. Silence disrupts the nervous system's cycle of escalation. Rage relies on reciprocal energy. Your body tenses, your voice rises, and both systems feed each other in a destructive loop. But silence severs the loop. It lowers your physiological arousal, slows your heartbeat, steadies your breath. And in that steadiness, you deny the other person the reward of your energy. Their nervous system, deprived of mutual escalation, must either self-destruct or calm. But silence is not merely external. It is also the quieting of the inner courtroom. When you do not answer, when you do not leap to defend yourself, You refuse to submit your soul to the endless trial of proving worth. And in this refusal, you awaken to a greater truth. You do not owe the world your defense. Your existence is not a case to be argued. You are. And that is enough. Consider the archetype of the sage, seated in stillness while chaos swirls around him. He speaks rarely, and when he does, his words weigh more than the endless chatter of the crowd. Why? Because his silence has given his voice gravity. In your own life, each time you choose silence, you accumulate the same gravity. You become someone whose presence commands attention, not because you shout, but because you don't. And here is where silence moves beyond strategy into transformation. When you practice it long enough, silence does not just protect you, it changes you. You begin to feel less controlled by the world, less enslaved to the moods of others. Their storms may still rage, but you remain rooted. You discover that you are not merely reacting to life, but shaping it by what you refuse to give. Silence, then, becomes not the absence of voice, but the presence of sovereignty. And sovereignty is magnetic. The one who cannot be provoked becomes the one others cannot ignore. For in your silence, they feel both the sting of their own emptiness and the awe of your composure. You reveal to them a power they cannot touch, because it does not reside in weapons or words, but in the depth of your being. Silence is a furnace. What enters as raw impulse emerges as tempered steel. The one who speaks in anger is consumed by it, but the one who holds silence allows the fire to refine rather than destroy. In those moments of restraint, you become a vessel where chaos is transformed into clarity. Every argument, every outburst, every storm in the human soul is a plea for recognition. Anger, at its root, is not power, but pain, disguised. It is the child who was not heard, the lover who was betrayed, the man who feels small in a vast world. When their voice rises, when their hands clench, when their eyes burn, they are begging the universe to notice their wound. And if you answer with words, you step into their wound, confirming its reality, binding yourself to their suffering. But when you answer with silence, you withhold the validation of conflict. You give them only themselves. And there, in that mirror, the wound is revealed. This is why silence is not only destructive to anger, but profoundly healing to you. You stop playing the endless game of justification. You begin to learn that not every attack deserves a defense. Not every wound must be carried as your own. In silence, you reclaim your energy from the chaos of others. You redirect it toward your own becoming. The Stoics framed this as discipline, but modern psychology calls it boundary. To be silent is to say, without speaking, your storm is not my climate. Your anger cannot dictate my nervous system, my tongue, or my peace. And in that stance, you declare something radical, that your inner life belongs to you alone. Consider the image of a lake at dawn. The wind has raged through the night, waves rising, crashing, breaking. But when morning comes, the wind dies, and the lake returns to stillness. The trees, the mountains, the very sky itself are reflected upon its surface. This is what your silence does. It restores the reflection. It allows truth to be seen again. And what of your enemy, your accuser, your tormentor? At first, they rage harder, furious that their power over you has slipped. Silence enrages the ego because it cannot dominate it. But eventually, the rage falters, the voice cracks, and the truth dawns. There is no opponent left to fight. There is only themselves. And whether they face it or flee it, their journey is now. their own. You have stepped outside the circle. But silence has another gift. It cultivates patience. In silence, you are no longer driven by the immediacy of reaction. You wait. You watch. You allow time itself to be your ally. And time, as every Stoic knew, reveals all things. Lies collapse. Anger cools. Truth surfaces. Your silence becomes the space in which justice unfolds without your interference. And here is the deeper archetypal truth. Silence is not emptiness. It is womb. It is the fertile darkness where transformation takes root. Every time you choose silence, you descend into that womb, refusing to scatter your energy outward. And when you rise again, you carry something stronger, sharper, more whole. You are reborn through restraint. So ask yourself, when the world throws its fury at you, will you become the storm or the mountain? Will you be swept into the unconscious whirl of projection, or will you stand in the silence that ends the cycle? For silence is not the absence of voice, it is the language of mastery, and those who learn to speak it discover that anger, no matter how loud, cannot touch the soul that has learned to be still. Silence is also the guardian of dignity. Words can betray you, slipping out too sharp, too desperate, too revealing. But silence never reveals more than you allow. It stands as armor, shielding your inner life from intrusion. And in this armor, you find not coldness, but clarity. For when you hold your tongue, you give your heart space to breathe. Think of all the quarrels that etched scars across your past. How many were born not from what was said to you, but from what you answered in haste? The words you regret are almost never the ones you withheld. Silence, then, is the art of regret avoided. It is wisdom made flesh. But silence is not mere avoidance. It is transformation. It alchemizes energy. The force you might have spent in retaliation becomes fuel for growth. In holding back the words that burn your tongue, you channel the fire inward. That energy can be forged into discipline, into creativity, into clarity of thought. What once would have been lost in an argument now becomes the foundation of your inner empire. The Stoics understood this as alignment with nature. The world is full of noise, but the logos, the rational principle that orders the cosmos, speaks in silence. When you are silent, you tune yourself to that deeper rhythm. You step out of the marketplace of words and into the sanctuary of wisdom. Marcus Aurelius often returned to this truth, that the universe is vast, and our quarrels are dust upon its surface. Silence is remembering that vastness. Psychologically, silence restores agency. In choosing not to respond, you remind yourself that you are free. Anger seeks to trap you in reflex, to make you a puppet, dancing on another's strings. But silence severs the strings. It says, "I am not yours to control." And in this refusal, you begin to see the contours of your own strength. Do you feel the paradox yet? To be silent is to feel powerless to the world's demand for reaction. And yet, in that very refusal, you become the most powerful presence in the room. The angry man rages, the woman accuses, the crowd jeers, and you remain still. They cannot pull you down. They cannot command you. Your silence becomes the throne upon which your sovereignty sits. This is why silence carries such weight in love, in conflict, in the intimate wars of human hearts. Words can be bent, twisted, dismissed, but silence lingers. It is remembered long after the moment passes. The lover who leaves in silence writes a deeper wound than one who storms out in fury. The leader who answers slander with silence becomes more respected than one who defends endlessly. Silence is the echo that does not fade, and so In every act of silence, you are not merely avoiding conflict. You are teaching the world how to treat you. You are saying, I will not be dragged where I do not choose to go. You are saying, I know my worth. And it does not tremble before your anger. You are saying, my energy is too precious to be squandered on noise. This is where silence destroys anger most completely. Not with violence, not with words, but with the simple truth that you cannot be owned. And when you embody this truth, anger, whether in others or in yourself, loses its throne. It becomes a wild animal pacing behind the bars of your mastery, unable to breach the stillness of your soul. Silence carries within it the weight of eternity. Words, no matter how sharp, are bound by the moment. They flash, they wound, they fade. But silence lingers like the echo of a bell in an empty hall. It does not vanish, it deepens. The angry one remembers not what you said, but what you withheld. And in that haunting absence, they are forced to confront truths no voice could ever compel them to see. Anger thrives on opposition. It is a creature of friction, feeding on the sparks of reaction. When you answer it with your own fire, the battle becomes endless, two shadows locked in a dance of destruction. But when silence greets it, anger stumbles. It has nothing to grip, nowhere to dig its claws. It roars into the void, and the void roars nothing back. Slowly, its power dissolves, like waves breaking against a cliff that never moves. This is why silence is feared more than argument. A voice can be countered, a point can be dismissed, an insult can be met with another insult. But silence offers no opening. It stands as an impenetrable wall, and what terrifies the one consumed by anger is not your retaliation, but your refusal. For refusal denies them what they seek most, confirmation that their fury has power over you. In the depths of psychology, silence reveals itself as the boundary between self and other. When you do not respond, you are saying, your chaos is yours. It will not spill into me. You are declaring sovereignty over your inner world. And that declaration is not shouted, but whispered through restraint. It is the quietest words that often carry the greatest truth. Think of the lover who leaves a room without explanation, their silence saying more than hours of argument could. Think of the sage who sits unmoved while disciples quarrel, his silence shaping them more than any sermon. Think of the general who endures insult without raising his voice, whose army respects him not for his temper, but for his composure. Silence, in every sphere of human life, is the crown of authority. Yet silence is not merely a tool to wield against others. It is medicine for the self. Each moment you resist the impulse to speak, you strengthen the muscle of restraint. You prove to yourself that you are larger than your impulses, that your dignity is not chained to circumstance. Over time, silence reshapes your very identity. You are no longer one who reacts, but one who chooses. And in that choice, you discover freedom. The Stoics saw this clearly, that mastery over one's tongue is mastery over one's soul. Epictetus reminded his students that you cannot control the world, but you can control your response to it. And silence is the purest form of that control. It is the point at which self-mastery and wisdom converge, creating a space where peace is no longer fragile, but unshakable. Silence destroys anger, not through confrontation, but through transcendence. It elevates you beyond the battlefield to a place where fury cannot reach. The angry one shouts from below, but you stand above, untouchable. And in that stance, you discover something profound. Silence is not emptiness. It is fullness. It is the fullness of presence, the fullness of dignity, the fullness of power that requires no proof. And when silence becomes your nature, anger loses its grip forever. For no one can chain the soul that has mastered the art of withholding. No one can wound the heart that has learned to be still. And no one can provoke the mind that has chosen to dwell in the sanctuary of silence. Silence is the rarest kind of strength, one that demands no audience, no applause, no recognition. It is the victory no one sees, but everyone feels. When you master it, the world senses your gravity. People lean toward you, not because of what you say, but because of what you do not. For in a society intoxicated with noise, silence is the most radical act of all. Think of the psychological warfare at play. The one who rages expects resistance. They thrive on escalation, on pulling you into their storm. When you refuse, when you stand still as stone, their fury has nowhere to land. It ricochets back, striking them instead. What was meant to weaken you collapses in on them, leaving them exposed, trembling in the weight of their own shadow. And this shadow is not small. Every unhealed wound lives there. Every unresolved humiliation, every moment of shame. Anger is only the mask that hides these wounds. Silence tears the mask away. Without your words to distract, the angry one must face themselves naked. And this is the deepest terror of all. Not you, not your silence, but the truth revealed in it. Here lies the wisdom of Jung. Projection thrives where silence is absent. The more you argue, the more you defend, the more you carry what is not yours. But in silence, the projection dies. It cannot cling to you, so it falls back into the one who cast it. They must now wrestle their own shadow. You have refused the burden, and in that refusal, you are free. Notice how silence does not crush you with repression, but lifts you into clarity. You begin to see patterns others cannot see. You notice how often anger is just fear in armor, how cruelty is only pain with a sharp tongue. And in that recognition, your compassion deepens, not a soft compassion that yields to abuse, but a fierce compassion that sees through illusion. Silence sharpens the vision, but silence does more than protect. It transforms the very atmosphere. Imagine standing in a room filled with shouting. One voice remains quiet, steady, unmoved. Slowly, the noise begins to fracture. Others turn toward the silence. They feel its pull. For silence is not void, it is gravity. It gathers attention. It bends the space around it. It demands reverence without asking. And those who once shouted are unsettled, for they realize that the loudest one is not the most powerful. The stillest is. The Stoics lived by this law. Epictetus spoke of self-command as the highest freedom. Marcus Aurelius reminded himself daily that insults harm only if he grants them power. Seneca declared that anger enslaves both victim and wielder alike, and across centuries, their message converges into one truth. Silence is the armor of the wise, the fortress of the strong, the signature of the free. When you wield silence, you step outside the small games of ego. You stop being the puppet of circumstance. You discover that the only kingdom worth ruling is the one within. And in ruling it, you find yourself no longer bound by the noise of the world. Silence is not escape. It is conquest. It is not emptiness. It is fullness. And once you have tasted its power, you realize that the storms of others no longer matter, because they cannot touch the mountain that refuses to move. Silence, in its highest form, is not just the absence of sound, but the revelation of self. when you no longer rush to justify, to retaliate, to explain, you uncover what remains once all performance is stripped away. What remains is essence, and essence does not need to shout. Observe how silence begins to change the very fabric of your relationships. Those who once attempted to bait you find their power diminished. Those who sought to provoke you realize they cannot penetrate your stillness. Slowly, the dynamics shift. The loudest voices fall quiet, not because you silenced them with words, but because your refusal to engage exposed the futility of their struggle. You become not an opponent, but a mystery, an unmoved presence that cannot be shaken. And yet silence is not isolation. It does not exile you from the human story. On the contrary, it brings you closer to truth. In silence, you begin to hear what words obscure: the trembling beneath the anger, the wound beneath the cruelty, the fear beneath the arrogance. You start to see the human behind the mask, and in that vision, compassion is born. Not a compassion that tolerates abuse, but one that understands the dance of shadows without being consumed by it. Silence also reshapes your inner dialogue. No longer do you replay arguments in your mind, crafting clever retorts, rehearsing battles that never end. The courtroom in your head dissolves. In its place comes space. Space for thought, for breath, for peace. And in that space, you realize that your worth was never on trial to begin with. Silence teaches you that you have nothing to prove, nothing to defend, nothing to beg from the world. The Stoics called this equanimity. Marcus Aurelius, in the solitude of his meditations, reminded himself that nothing external can harm the soul unless the soul consents. Silence is that refusal of consent. It is the boundary that protects the inner citadel, the fortress of your being. Each moment you hold silence, you strengthen its walls. You become unassailable, not because life no longer challenges you, but because you have chosen not to surrender your peace to the noise of others. This is the paradox. Silence feels, at first, like loss, as though you are giving up your voice, your chance to win. But in truth, silence is the greater victory. It is the victory over the impulse to react, over the ego's hunger to be right, over the fear of being misunderstood. It is the victory of the self over the self, and that victory is eternal. What then becomes of anger in the presence of silence? It withers, it dies, it may scream, it may thrash, but ultimately it consumes itself. And you, standing apart, remain untouched, sovereign in your stillness. And here lies the final transformation. Silence is no longer something you practice. It is something you are. It ceases to be a tactic and becomes your nature. You radiate a calm that cannot be disturbed, a power that cannot be taken, a dignity that cannot be broken. You become, in the truest sense, free.